I'd like to invite to the podium now Doug Daugherty. Doug is Ramboll Environ's global port sector environmental leader. He's based in San Francisco, California. He has a lot of experience, over 20 years, working and supporting the port sector on a variety of issues, including sustainability, and he's actively involved in Workgroup 174 and Workgroup 188 in PIANC, addressing many of the matters he's going to talk about now. So thank you, Doug.
All right, good morning. As Todd mentioned, I am part of Workgroup 188. I'm actually the chair, so I'll be talking about our efforts to date on developing a guidance for carbon management for port and the navigation infrastructure. The group was only formed about a year ago, so we're about midway through our work efforts to develop the guidance documents. So today, really, I want to focus very briefly on background because I think you've already heard enough of that in the morning sessions, but really focus on what are the objectives of our work group in regards to this carbon management framework, and then talk a little bit more about some case studies that we've identified to date. As you've already heard in great detail this morning about the Paris Agreement, that really forms, I think, the backdrop for why these activities are ongoing in the navigation sector. Really, the national commitments to reduce greenhouse gases, some things were left out. You heard about the global shipping. Really, I think there was a hope that IMO will address that globally. We heard this morning if that doesn't happen, then maybe things will happen on a regional basis. And then why the Think Climate Coalition actually formed and developed an action plan to really address both pillars of climate change. The first on the mitigating the emissions of the compounds that are leading to climate change, and then in preparation for expected climate change, how can the navigation infrastructure adapt? So from our work group perspective, why would this sector want to manage the carbon as part of its routine processes? And we came up with 5 items. The first one is really the base. This is this regulatory compliance. There are some areas that already have existing regulations related to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, and there's likely to be more emerging regulations as the Paris Agreement implementation goes forward. You could also be responding to your stakeholders, either your tenants, the logistics chain, or the public that's nearby to your operations, to reduce your environmental burdens. But then I think we got to more areas where I think sets well with the motto PIANC that's there on the corner of setting the course, of being more of a leader in this area, taking a leadership role on what carbon management practices should be for the navigation sector. And what innovation can we develop in regards to that that could help drive investment, and quite frankly, it can also help influence future practice or inform future regulation for the sector. And the last item is interesting because I think it's a unique aspect of the navigation infrastructure. Are there unique opportunities to reduce or offset carbon emissions? Because if some projects actually may have as a mitigation measure, you may be implementing an adaptation that involves restoration of ecosystems, which become a sink for carbon. So you're no longer emitting it, you're actually taking it out of the atmosphere. So are there opportunities there for this sector? So what did PIANC charge Workgroup 188 to do? Really go out into the world of what is out there, what is available in regards to carbon footprinting that would be relevant for navigation infrastructure and its supporting activities. Include consideration of the whole life cycle analysis that could be available for such projects, and look for opportunities to reduce greenhouse gases, not just from the operational perspective, but are there others that lead to this ability to offset that I mentioned, either developing things with working with nature, land use management, blue carbon projects that could lead to offsets available for the project. So like I said, we've only been really active for about a year. We've set up our governance. We have members both from the European Union as well as the United States, and we have 2 members from Asia Pacific. And we have decided upon the scope that our guidance document will cover, and are currently developing text. We actually have a work group meeting on Wednesday at Port of Antwerp to go through our first kind of rough compilation of text in line with the scope we want to cover. And when we've gone out there is relevant information that is out there to inform our activities. There are framework guidance as well as a management standard that's out there for general infrastructure. These are your roads, bridges, typical type of buildings, typical infrastructure projects that are common in many countries. What's really missing from these is the unique aspect for navigation infrastructure, and that's the charge of our work group, is to really add on to these efforts that are already out there. I don't want to recreate the wheel, but we need to add to what's already out there in order to make the guidance very useful for our sector. Another aspect is looking for available information on emissions quantification, both on the operational source side, but then also on sequestration methodologies and other calculation methodologies. Our charge is not to recreate new methodologies. Our charge, as we see, is really what is the world that's available to someone setting up a carbon management framework, and what are the pros and cons of using different methodologies that are out there. Now, this was a very important milestone for the group, so I'll take a little bit of time with this. This is where we decided to take on the full life cycle scope for a navigation infrastructure project. And it starts here with design at the noon position on the clock, and that is likely to have very small contributions to an overall greenhouse gas footprint for a project. But this is where you have the greatest ability to decide what that lifetime carbon footprint will be for your infrastructure. You can make decisions here that will either increase it or decrease it over that lifespan. So it's a very important part of the role. Next is you're going to be using materials that have embodied carbon from the manufacturer and transport of that material to your project that can be accounted for. Next is construction. You obviously have to build the infrastructure, and that's going to take some energy in order to do that. And then uniquely, I think for the navigation infrastructure, the one here at the 6 o'clock is, in some projects you will have associated restorations. Either it will be a mitigation as part of the permit to build it or operate it, or you'll hear more tomorrow about the adaptation to climate change, you could be doing something with working with nature. That would add elements that could sequester carbon. And so it's a very important aspect for our guidance document to cover. Then obviously there's the operation and maintenance of that infrastructure, and maintenance would include if there's, say, dredging maintenance associated with the infrastructure. And then finally, the end of life. At the end of the life of that infrastructure, what are we going to do with it? Can it be recycled, reused, or disposed of? So that's the full life cycle that the work group has decided to tackle in our guidance document. And I want to emphasize, we're not developing a prescriptive document. This is not you shall do certain things. This is, our goal really is to, here's the world of things that are available, here's what you should consider as part of your management decisions, because we want to cover that full life cycle, but in the end, there's management decisions on how much of that life cycle that you want to tackle in your carbon management framework. You have to decide what boundaries you're going to set, how you're going to deal with your stakeholders in the process, and how you're going to report and monitor, and we want to cover all those in our document. We'll have a reference sections for quantification methods, and as I mentioned, it's both on the operational side as well as the sequestration side. And we want to focus the document on what's best practices out there for reductions and what kind of co-benefits can you get from that. And I'll talk a little bit more about co-benefits in our example here in a minute. And then we definitely want to include financial decision-making considerations, because all this has a financial cost. Sometimes you get a financial benefit from some measures, so we want to make sure we address that. And then talk about relevant case studies. And with that, I'll move into the last part of my talk, really focusing on three case studies developed or identified by the group to date. This first one is actually, I was lead of the consulting team that helped the Port of San Diego develop their climate action plan, which was their plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on all the tidelands that they manage. And it wasn't just their greenhouse gas. They took on the charge of looking at the greenhouse gas footprint of their tenants as well. Because we heard a little bit about, what should you take on as part of the process. They really wanted to do that, to be a leader in this field. They have a very proactive green port program, a very proactive board who wants to seem to be the port being green. It's in a beautiful location in San Diego Bay, so they truly wanted to be seen as a leader in this. Plus, they wanted to see doing their fair share to help California reduce its statewide emissions, because we have statewide commitments to reduce our carbon emissions. And the framework really focuses both on the two aspects, new projects, and I think as part of our graphic that gets to, sorry, wrong button. The design, construction, and then the operation of any new projects. The framework wanted to cover that, and then for the existing operations, they're also covered, but that implementation obviously has to be different than for a new project. The main elements is they had to project emissions from their baseline year to the future, and again, they included their tenant emissions as well. They had to set their goals, which was 10% below the baseline. They developed policies with reduction measures with various co-benefits associated with them to implement over the lifespan of their plan. Most of the reductions, as you could imagine, for an entire port operation is related to the transportation land use side, energy conservation or efficiency, and alternative energy generation. That's where they're really going to achieve their goal, is through those three big categories. And I brought one paper copy with me, so if you visit me in the booth, you can see it in a little bit more detail, but a good aspect of their plan is when they developed the different categories. I think this is land use. They list their policies and measures, but they also took great care to focus on the co-benefits, because some of these measures would result in improvement of local air quality, health, sometimes the safety of the operations. So they wanted to be able to identify not just, I'm doing this because I get a greenhouse gas reduction, but look at all these other benefits I get along with these projects. So it's a great communication tool for their stakeholders to understand that there was more than just one aspect that they were managing here and making improvements in. The second example is from another one of our work group members from the Harvard Port Authority. And they do report greenhouse gas emissions for mainly compliance with French law. They report their carbon equivalent emissions, and they have to report on actions that they are taking to implement to reduce emissions. Since it's for regulatory compliance, is really their direct sources under control. Interestingly, it also includes any biomass emissions from the areas that they manage. But they do look at other indirect sources, such as the infrastructure energy use, emissions from waste, as well as dredging emissions as part of that, but it does not include tenants. So again, a different choice for a different reason in this case study. And then the final case study is from our U.S. Army Corps members. This was actually published in the Science of Total Environment, and the authors are up there, but it was really looking at specific scenarios for dredge sediment placement, including building a containment island that could be used then for migrating bird use. And they looked at a lot of environmental factors. I only pulled out the greenhouse gas part for this example. But as you can imagine, for the typical open water placement, any upland scenario or even this containment island would have a higher footprint than it would for open placement. One thing I will note is that I think for the containment, there's a lot of emissions in the building of it, so you could look at design on whether you can design it more efficiently, so less greenhouse gas emissions. And it didn't account for the carbon that would be sequestered over the lifetime of that containment island, which I think would have reduced that middle bar quite a good deal. And as I'm almost at the end of my time, I will conclude that hopefully I've given you some sense of that we need a plan if we want to try to achieve our goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the navigation sector. It's my favorite quote up there when talking about plans. Like if a goal doesn't have a plan, it's really just a wish. But some concluding comments for you to take away from this, and from the work group's perspective, we think carbon management plans will become more prevalent in the navigation sector. Actually, in some ports, it's migrating into an energy management plan because they're becoming managers of energies. And one ask from the work group is, I talked about 3 examples today. We really would like more examples to showcase within our report, especially any from inland waterway examples. So if you have any, please see me during one of the breaks. We'd love to include your example in our document. Thank you very much.